According to the American Alliance of Museums, or AAM, Code of Ethics, museum programming should include respect to pluralistic values, traditions, and concerns. I believe that, to serve the widest possible audience, as stated on the AAM website, these institutions should inform the public about the widest variety of perspectives and encourage visitors to broaden their knowledge beyond the familiar. However, due to lasting legacies of white supremacy in the West, and particularly in the United States, this has been difficult to fully realize. Less than 8% of the 86,000 sites included on the National Register of Historic Places represent African American and other minority heritage. This lack of representation occurs even in places where it would be seemingly self-evident, such as Sullivan's Island in South Carolina, a place where slave ships would dock to quarantine their enslaved human cargo. Despite this location's important role in the American slave trade, it took nearly 200 years for a single marker or indicator of this history to be placed on the island. Another example of this lack of representation is Fredericksburg, Virginia, a colonial town that in 2001 proposed a national slavery museum that was ultimately never realized. This is a town that had many Confederate monuments, and in many ways pushed the lost cause narrative in public spaces, with many of its residents identifying with its colonial and Civil War history. Because of the emphasis placed on these topics in public spaces across the city, it is easy to forget the role slavery played in shaping the city's landscape, much like in Sullivan's Island. These same people who identify with the city's Civil War history protested the proposed slavery museum. As illustrated by the previous examples, this lack of representation from marginalized cultures in favor of symbols of white supremacy is most notable in the American South, where slavery and its legacy have survived even past the supposed Reconstruction after the Civil War, with many places instead choosing to focus on the supposed glory of the Confederacy and its leaders, their statues, and the naming of streets and public institutions such as schools, while perpetuating the lost cause narrative. In 2018, the Southern Poverty Law Center identified and cataloged public symbols of the Confederacy through a nationwide survey. They identified in total 772 monuments, 105 public schools named for Confederate icons, 80 counties and cities named for Confederate leaders, 9 observed state holidays in 5 states, and 10 U.S. military bases. Gwendolyn Saul In Whose Honor? On Monuments, Public Spaces, Historical Narratives, and Memory, argues that power is manipulated in these public spaces, as historical narratives are embedded in the physical environment. These public naming conventions embed the violence and racism of American history in permanent material forms. This is where a statue of Jefferson Davis used to be displayed on the University of Texas at Austin campus. It was one of the many Confederate statues that were removed across the country in 2017, amidst nationwide conversations about statues of this nature in the wake of the Charlottesville White Supremacist March. Its construction was sponsored by former Confederate Army officer George W. Littlefield, the namesake of the famous Littlefield Fountain. This statue and multiple others revering Confederate leaders were removed and are currently housed in the Briscoe Center for American History, with the Jefferson Davis statue being displayed in an exhibit, albeit with a wall blocking view of him from the outside of the museum. Even when the stories of enslaved people and their descendants are shared, much information about the legacy of systemic discrimination are downplayed or barely explored. Johanna Foster in Where is the Public Sociology in Public Social Movement History Cites, The Case of the Civil Rights Movement, visits many civil rights museums across the U.S. and notes that there were little to no mentions of the details of slavery, such as the long-term material and financial consequences of enslaved people being unable to own property or earn wages for hundreds of years. This, combined with multiple other laws and codes, continued wealth accumulation for white people at the expense of black people. All of these circumstances result in the contemporary structural inequalities of the U.S., an important aspect of context that is missing in many of these institutions and their exhibits. Ultimately, these dilemmas in representation prove that pluralistic concerns are not always accurately displayed in many museums, public spaces, and various cultural heritage institutions. If a museum truly wants to adhere to the AAM Code of Ethics, it needs to fully tackle this issue and deconstruct historical assumptions based on centuries of white supremacy in the US, from larger museums such as the National Civil Rights Museum to smaller ones, such as Southern House and Plantation Museum. It is important for cultural heritage organizations and the managers of public spaces to examine the ways in which they might be continuing narratives of a white supremacist past at the expense of non-white and Black perspectives.